Hell's Angel helped a woman who fainted, then learned she was his ex's child. The neon sign of Jimmy's Diner cast a soft red glow across the empty sidewalk. Jack Bear Carter leaned against the brick wall, his weathered leather jacket creaking as he shifted his weight. The evening air had turned crisp, carrying the first hints of autumn. He took a long drag from his cigarette, watching the smoke drift up into the darkening sky. His calloused fingers, adorned with silver rings, held the cigarette loosely as his mind wandered to darker places. 25 years in the club had left their mark on him, not just in the tattoos that covered his arms and peaked above his collar, but in the weight he carried in his chest. The things he'd seen, the things he'd done, they had a way of creeping up on him in quiet moments like this. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. The street was mostly empty, save for a few cars passing by and the occasional person hurrying home from work. Through the diner's windows, he could see the usual evening crowd. Truckers nursing cups of coffee, elderly couples sharing pieces of pie, a young woman sitting alone in a booth near the window. Something about her caught his eye. She looked tired, almost fragile, with auburn hair falling around her face as she stared into her untouched cup of coffee. There was a sadness about her that seemed out of place for someone so young. Jack dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his boot, the orange ember dying against the concrete. That's when he heard it. A soft thud behind him, like someone dropping a bag of groceries. He turned around, his large frame moving with surprising quickness. The young woman from the diner window was crumpled on the sidewalk, her purse spilled open beside her. Her face was pale, too pale, and her body lay motionless on the cold concrete. "Hey!" Jack's gruff voice carried across the empty street as he rushed to her side. Up close, she looked even younger, maybe early 20s. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, but her eyes remained closed. Jack's hands, used to gripping motorcycle handlebars and throwing punches, now moved with unexpected gentleness as he checked her pulse. It was there, but weak and fluttering like a trapped bird. Her skin felt cool to the touch. "Someone call an ambulance," he shouted, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being obeyed. A few people who had been walking by stopped in their tracks, staring at the scene before them. "Don't just stand there gawking. Get help." The girl stirred slightly under his touch, her eyelids fluttering, but she didn't wake. Jack felt something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine concern for a stranger. There was something about her vulnerability that struck a chord in him, making his chest tighten with worry. He placed his leather jacket under her head as a makeshift pillow, his large hands moving with surprising tenderness. The tattoos on his arms, skulls, flames, and the Hell's Angel's insignia seemed at odds with the gentle way he cradled her head. "Come on, kid," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Stay with me here." His eyes scanned her face, looking for any sign of consciousness. Behind him, he could hear the diner's door opening, footsteps approaching, and voices raising in concern. Jack remained focused on the girl, his weathered face creased with worry as he monitored her breathing. He'd seen plenty of people hurt before, had caused more than his share of pain. But this was different. This wasn't the result of violence or choice. This was something else entirely, and it stirred something protective in him he didn't know he still possessed. Without hesitation, Jack slipped his arms under the unconscious girl. Her slight frame felt like nothing against his muscled bulk as he lifted her from the cold sidewalk. Her head lolled against his chest, and he could feel her shallow breathing through his t-shirt. "Clear the way!" he barked, his voice cutting through the growing crowd of onlookers. The diner's bell chimed as someone held the door open for him. The warmth of Jimmy's Diner enveloped them as Jack carried her inside. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her pale face, making her look even more fragile. The usual dinner chatter died down as heads turned to watch the strange scene unfold. A tattooed biker cradling an unconscious young woman. "Someone call an ambulance," Jack ordered, his voice gruff but controlled. He carefully laid her down in the nearest booth, making sure her head was supported by the vinyl cushioning. "And get some water, maybe sugar, anything that might help." Sally, the veteran waitress with graying hair and kind eyes, was already on the phone with emergency services. "They're on their way, honey," she called out, then turned back to give details to the dispatcher. Another waitress, younger and clearly flustered, hurried over with a glass of water and some sugar packets. Her hands shook as she set them on the table. "Is she going to be okay?" Jack ignored the question, focusing instead on the girl's face. He took her small hand in his, noting how cold it felt. His rough fingers, marked with old scars and leather-worn calluses, seemed out of place against her delicate skin. The diner had gone quiet except for the soft murmur of concerned voices and the gentle hum of the refrigerator units. The overhead lights buzzed steadily, casting everything in a harsh fluorescent glow. Jack could feel the other customers' eyes on him, probably wondering what a man like him was doing playing Good Samaritan. "Come on, kid," he muttered, squeezing her hand gently. "Wake up." Sally bustled over with a damp cloth and began dabbing at the girl's forehead. "Ambulance is about 10 minutes out," she said, her experienced eyes assessing the situation. "Poor thing looks exhausted. When's the last time you ate something, honey?" she asked, though the girl couldn't answer. Jack watched as color slowly began returning to the girl's cheeks. Her eyelids fluttered, and her fingers twitched in his grasp. A small crowd had gathered around the booth, but Jack's imposing presence kept them at a respectful distance. Finally, her eyes opened, pale blue eyes that seemed somehow familiar. They were unfocused at first, then gradually cleared as she took in her surroundings. Her gaze settled on Jack's face, and something changed in her expression. Recognition flickered across her features, though Jack was certain he'd never seen her before. Her lips parted, and she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "You're my father, aren't you?" The words hit Jack like a physical blow. His hand went slack in hers as the implications of those 5 words crashed over him. Before he could process what she'd said, before he could form any response, her eyes rolled back, and she slipped into unconsciousness once again. Jack sat there, stunned into absolute silence, his world tilting on its axis. The diner's ambient noise faded to a distant buzz as those words echoed in his head. "You're my father, aren't you?" The wail of sirens pierced the evening air as red and white lights strobed through the diner's windows. 2 paramedics burst through the door, their boots squeaking against the linoleum floor as they made their way to Clara's booth. Jack stepped back, giving them space to work, but his eyes never left the girl's face. "What happened here?" the first paramedic asked, kneeling beside Clara and checking her vital signs. "She collapsed outside," Jack said, his voice rough. "Just fell right there on the sidewalk." Sally, the waitress, hovered nearby. "Poor thing hasn't come around properly since." The second paramedic wrapped a blood pressure cuff around Clara's arm, while his partner shined a small flashlight in her eyes. "Has anyone contacted her family?" Before anyone could answer, the diner's bell chimed again. A woman rushed in, her heels clicking rapidly against the floor. She was in her mid-40s, with auburn hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing scrubs under a hastily thrown-on coat. "Clara!" she called out, pushing through the small crowd. "That's my daughter." Jack's head snapped up at the sound of that voice. His stomach clenched as recognition hit him like a physical blow. Caroline Dawson. 20 years older but unmistakably her. Caroline stopped short when she saw him, her face draining of color. "Jack," she whispered, the name catching in her throat. The paramedics continued their work, oblivious to the tension crackling between the two. "Ma'am, your daughter's vital signs are stable," one reported, "but we'd like to take her to the hospital for observation." Caroline nodded, but her eyes remained locked on Jack. He could see fear there, and something else. Guilt, maybe. The same words kept spinning through his head. "You're my father, aren't you?" As the paramedics prepared to move Clara to the stretcher, Caroline took a hesitant step towards Jack. "We need to talk," she said softly. "Talk?" Jack's voice was dangerous and low. "After 20 years, now you want to talk?" "Please, Jack. Not here." They moved to a quiet corner of the diner while the paramedics transferred Clara. The other customers pretended not to watch, but Jack could feel their curious stares. "Is it true?" he demanded, though he already knew the answer. He could see it in Caroline's face, in the way Clara's eyes had looked so familiar. Caroline wrapped her arms around herself, as if seeking protection from the fury radiating off him. "Yes," she whispered. "Clara is your daughter." The confirmation hit Jack like a punch to the gut. He braced himself against the wall, his weathered hands clenching into fists. 20 years, he growled. "You kept my own daughter from me for 20 years?" "I tried to protect her," Caroline said, her voice trembling. "You were different then, Jack. The life you were living, I couldn't expose a child to that." "You had no right," his voice rose, causing heads to turn. He lowered it again, but the intensity remained. "No right to make that choice for me. Jack, please, let me explain." But Jack was already moving, pushing past her towards the door. His mind was a storm of emotions he couldn't process. Rage, confusion, guilt, fear. The bell above the door jangled violently as he shoved it open, leaving Caroline standing there with tears in her eyes and 20 years of secrets finally exposed. The night air bit at Jack's face as he stormed away from the diner, his heavy boots pounding against the concrete. His hands were shaking, and not from the cold. 20 years. 20 years of his life gone, and now this bombshell drops right in his lap. Clara's face kept flashing in his mind, pale, vulnerable, looking up at him with those eyes that somehow seemed to pierce right through his carefully built walls. His daughter. The word felt foreign, like trying to speak a language he'd never learned. He walked faster, as if he could outrun the thoughts chasing him. The streets were quiet now, most shops closed for the night. His reflection bounced back at him from darkened windows. A big man, covered in tattoos, leather vest bearing the patches that marked him as a Hell's Angel. What kind of father could someone like him be? "You're my father, aren't you?" Her words echoed in his head, over and over. The hope in her voice, even as she was barely conscious, twisted something deep in his chest. He'd walked away from Caroline all those years ago, telling himself it was for the best. He'd been young, angry, dangerous, everything a father shouldn't be. Jack passed by a young couple walking hand in hand. They crossed to the other side of the street when they saw him coming, hurrying their pace. He was used to that reaction, had even learned to take a certain pride in it. But tonight, it just reminded him of all the reasons he shouldn't be anybody's father. The memories he'd buried started surfacing. Caroline's smile, the way she used to believe he could be better than he was, the fights that got worse and worse until finally he'd gotten on his bike and never looked back. He'd convinced himself it was the right thing to do. But if he'd known— "Damn it!" he growled, startling a stray cat that darted into an alley. If he'd known about Clara, would it have made a difference? Would he have cleaned up his act, become the kind of man who could raise a daughter? Or would he have just destroyed her life too? His feet carried him through familiar streets, past boarded-up storefronts and flickering streetlights. The neighborhood hadn't changed much in 20 years. Still rough around the edges, still the kind of place where people learned to watch their backs. The kind of place he belonged. The neon sign of O'Malley's bar cast a red glow on the wet pavement. Jack paused, staring at the familiar entrance. How many nights had he spent here, drowning his memories in cheap whiskey? It seemed fitting that his feet would bring him back here tonight. He pushed through the heavy door, the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke wrapping around him like an old friend. The bartender, Mickey, looked up and nodded in recognition. Jack had been coming here long enough that they didn't need words. Mickey set up a glass and poured 2 fingers of Jack Daniels without being asked. Jack settled onto a worn bar stool, his broad shoulders hunched forward as he stared into the amber liquid. The bar's other patrons gave him a wide berth, his reputation, or maybe just his current mood, keeping them at a safe distance. He lifted the glass, watching the whiskey catch the dim light. A daughter. He had a daughter who'd been walking around in the world for 20-some years without him knowing she existed. And now she was sick. That much was obvious from her collapse. What was he supposed to do with that? Clara lay in her childhood bed, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars she'd stuck to her ceiling when she was 12. They were faded now, barely visible even in the darkness, but she knew each constellation by heart. Her fingers absently traced the soft cotton of her quilt as her mind replayed the events at the diner. The memory of Jack's face was crystal clear, weathered and tough, with deep lines around his eyes that spoke of hard years. But there had been something else there, too, a flash of concern when she'd collapsed. She'd seen it through the fog of her dizzy spell, the way his strong hands had steadied her, gentle despite their roughness. Her heart fluttered, and not just from her condition. She'd waited so long, imagined this moment countless times, but nothing had prepared her for actually meeting him. She touched her chest, feeling the familiar irregular rhythm beneath her palm. The doctors had warned her about stress, but how could she not be stressed? Her father, the mystery man she'd wondered about her whole life, was suddenly real. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made her turn her head. Her mother's shadow appeared under the door before she knocked softly. "Come in," Clara called, her voice barely above a whisper. Caroline entered, carrying a steaming mug of chamomile tea. She looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from carrying too many worries for too long. Setting the mug on the bedside table, she perched on the edge of Clara's bed. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Caroline asked, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from Clara's forehead. "I'm okay." Clara tried to smile, but it felt wobbly. "Just thinking about him." Caroline's hand stilled. "Clara, Mom, please, I need to know. What was he like? When you knew him?" Her mother's eyes grew distant, focused on something Clara couldn't see. "Jack was complicated. He could be gentle one moment and explosive the next. The club was everything to him." "The Hells Angels?" Clara asked, sitting up straighter despite her weakness. Caroline nodded slowly. "There were fights. Dangerous people. I never knew when he'd come home hurt, or if he'd come home at all." She took Clara's hand, squeezing it gently. "That's why I never told him about you. I wanted to protect you from that life." "But maybe he's different now," Clara insisted, though uncertainty crept into her voice. "You saw him today. He helped me when I fainted. A truly bad person wouldn't have done that." "Oh, honey," Caroline's voice softened. "Jack was never all bad. That's what made it so hard. He had good in him. Still does, I suppose. But his life, his choices, they were dangerous. I couldn't risk exposing you to that. Clara pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself small under the blankets. I still want to meet him properly, to talk to him. Her voice quivered. But what if he doesn't want to know me? What if he walks away again? She felt her mother's arms wrap around her, strong and familiar. The scent of her perfume, the same one she'd worn all through Clara's childhood, brought tears to Clara's eyes. I know you want to know him, Caroline said softly. But sweetheart, you need to understand. The life he led, there were violent incidents, run-ins with the law. I tried to protect you from all that. Clara wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. I understand why you kept it from me, but I'm not a child anymore, Mom. I need to know who he is, even if it hurts. Despite her brave words, anxiety churned in her stomach. What if her father's earlier kindness had been just a reflex? What if he wanted nothing to do with her? Jack sat on an old wooden stool in his garage, surrounded by the familiar smell of motor oil and metal. The space was neat, but lived in, with tools hanging on pegboards and his cherished Harley-Davidson gleaming under the fluorescent lights. In his weathered hands, he held a creased photograph, its edges worn soft from years of handling. The photo showed a younger version of himself, less gray in his beard, fewer lines around his eyes. His arm was wrapped around Caroline's waist, both of them smiling into the camera. Her smile had always been beautiful, lighting up her whole face. That was before everything went wrong, before the fights and the violence that drove them apart. Jack ran his thumb over Caroline's image. Should have told me, he muttered, his voice rough in the empty garage. The anger that had flared at the diner still simmered, but now it mixed with something else. Regret, maybe. Or guilt. He remembered their last big fight like it was yesterday. Caroline had been crying, begging him to leave the club, to choose a different life. He'd been too proud, too stubborn. The club had been his family, his identity. He couldn't see then what walking away would cost him. Setting the photo on his workbench, Jack stood and paced the length of the garage. His boots echoed on the concrete floor. Clara's face floated in his mind, so much like Caroline's, but with something of him in there too. The way she'd looked at him in the diner, with hope and fear mixed together, kept coming back to him. A daughter, he said to the empty garage, testing the word out loud. It felt foreign on his tongue. He'd never imagined himself as a father. The life he'd lived, the things he'd done. None of it seemed compatible with raising a kid. Jack stopped in front of his motorcycle and ran his hand along its chrome handlebars. For years, this had been his escape route whenever things got too complicated. Just hop on and ride until his problems were dust in his rearview mirror. But something held him back this time. The image of Clara collapsing on the sidewalk flashed through his mind. She'd been so pale, so fragile-looking. Despite his best efforts to stay detached, his protective instincts had kicked in immediately. Was that what being a father felt like? He walked back to the workbench and picked up the photo again. 20-plus years was a long time to make up for. He didn't even know where to start, what to say to her. Sorry I wasn't there. Sorry I didn't know you existed. Everything sounded hollow in his head. But as he stood there, staring at his younger self, Jack realized he couldn't walk away. Not this time. The thought of Clara waiting for him, hoping he'd show up, it stirred something in him he thought he'd buried years ago. With a deep breath, Jack tucked the photo into his jacket pocket. He grabbed his keys from the workbench and walked to his bike. He didn't know what he'd say to Clara, or if she'd even want to see him after he'd stormed out of the diner. But he knew he had to try. Starting up his Harley, Jack felt the familiar rumble beneath him. Caroline had given him Clara's address before he'd walked out. He wasn't ready to be anybody's father, wasn't sure he'd ever be ready. But he could at least show up. That had to count for something. The evening sun cast long shadows across Clara's front porch as Jack stood before the modest two-story house. White paint peeled from the wooden siding, and bright pink petunias spilled from hanging baskets, softening the home's weathered appearance. His motorcycle helmet dangled from his fingertips, a protective shield he wasn't ready to let go of yet. Jack's boots felt heavy as lead on the wooden steps. The porch boards creaked under his weight, each sound seeming to echo his thundering heartbeat. He raised his hand to knock, then lowered it, then raised it again. 24 years of absence weighed on his shoulders like a physical burden. Before he could decide whether to knock or retreat, the door opened. Carolyn stood there, her hand still on the doorknob. She looked different from the photograph in his garage. Older, of course, but with the same quiet strength in her eyes. Her expression was cautious but not unwelcoming. "I thought I heard someone on the porch," she said softly. "Come in, Jack. Clara's in the living room." Jack nodded, unable to find words. He followed Caroline through a narrow hallway decorated with framed photos. He couldn't help glancing at them. Snapshots of Clara growing up, moments he'd missed, birthday parties, school graduations, holiday celebrations. His throat tightened. The living room was small but cozy, with worn furniture and handmade quilts draped over the backs of chairs. Clara sat on an old floral sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked better than she had at the diner, but still pale. When she saw Jack, she straightened up, trying to appear stronger than she felt. "Hi," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Hey," he managed. He stayed standing, uncertain where to put himself in this unfamiliar space. Caroline gestured to an armchair across from Clara. "Why don't you sit down, Jack? I'll make some coffee." Jack sank into the chair, setting his helmet on the floor beside him. Clara watched him with wide eyes, eyes that looked so much like his own. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. "Thank you," Clara said suddenly, "for helping me at the diner." Jack shrugged, his leather jacket creaking. "Anyone would have done the same." "Maybe." Clara fidgeted with the hem of her sweater. "But it was you who was there." Something in her voice, a mixture of hope and uncertainty, made Jack's carefully constructed walls waver. He noticed how her hands trembled slightly, how she kept glancing at him and then away, as if afraid to look too long. She was trying so hard to be brave, this daughter he never knew he had. "You feeling better now?" he asked, his gruff voice gentler than before. Clara nodded. "Yes. The doctors say I just need to be careful about overexerting myself." "Happens often?" The protective instinct that had surfaced at the diner stirred again. "Sometimes." She offered a small smile. "Mom worries too much about it." Jack found himself leaning forward slightly. "Seems like she's had reason to worry." Clara's smile wavered, and Jack could see the years of loneliness behind it. The need for a father's presence was written clearly in her expression, in the way she hung on his every word. It hit him then, really hit him, what his absence had meant. This wasn't just about him anymore, or even about Caroline keeping secrets. This was about Clara, who had grown up wondering why she didn't have a father who cared enough to stay. The morning sun filtered through the diner's windows as Jack watched Clara stir her coffee. 3 days had passed since their first meeting, and this was their 4th attempt at breakfast together. Each time, the silence seemed to stretch longer, filled with words neither knew how to say. Clara's spoon clinked against her cup as she set it down. "So," she said, forcing cheerfulness into her voice, "did you always like motorcycles?" Jack shifted in the vinyl booth. "Yeah, started riding when I was 16. He paused, then added, "Your mother hated it." Clara's shoulders tensed at the mention of Caroline. She took a careful sip of coffee, her hands trembling slightly. "Mom doesn't like anything dangerous?" "Can't blame her," Jack muttered, thinking of Clara's condition. He wanted to ask about it, but every time he tried, she changed the subject. The waitress brought their plates, pancakes for Clara, eggs and bacon for Jack. They ate in silence, the clink of cutlery filling the space between them. Jack noticed how Clara picked at her food, taking tiny bites, as if eating was an effort. The next day, they met at the park. Clara sat on a bench, wrapped in a sweater despite the mild weather. Jack stood awkwardly nearby, watching kids play on the swings. "You don't have to keep doing this," Clara said suddenly. Jack turned to her, frowning. "Doing what?" "Spending time with me. I know it's weird." She stared at her hands. "I shouldn't have sprung it on you like that." Jack's chest tightened. He took a step toward the bench, then stopped. "Look, kid." "Don't call me that," Clara interrupted, her voice sharp. Then, softer. "Please, I'm not a kid anymore." Jack ran a hand through his graying hair. "Clara," he corrected himself, "I'm here because I want to be." But even as he said it, he saw her withdraw, pulling her sweater tighter around herself like armor. The wall between them felt higher than ever. 2 days later, Jack spotted Clara outside the grocery store. He was about to call out when he noticed something wrong in her stance. She was leaning against a car, her face pale, one hand pressed against her forehead. Her shopping bag had slipped from her grip, oranges rolling across the pavement. Jack started forward, but Clara straightened up quickly when another shopper approached. She smiled, waved off their concern, and bent to gather her spilled groceries. Her hands were shaking, but she pretended everything was fine. From his spot across the parking lot, Jack watched helplessly. He recognized the same stubborn independence he'd always had, the refusal to show weakness, to accept help. But seeing it in Clara, watching her struggle alone when he was right there, made his chest ache in a way he'd never experienced before. She steadied herself against the car again when she thought no one was looking. Jack's fingers curled into fists at his sides, fighting the urge to rush over. He knew she wouldn't welcome his help. She'd made that clear with every careful distance she kept, every conversation she deflected. But standing there, watching his daughter fight her own battles without him, Jack had never felt more useless in his life. The distance between them stretched across the parking lot like a physical thing, built of years of absence and uncertainty, of his mistakes and her fears. Jack stood rooted to the spot, a spectator to his daughter's struggle, unable to bridge the gap between them. The coffee shop was nearly empty when Caroline slid into the booth across from Jack. Her face was drawn, and she clutched her purse tightly in her lap. Outside, rain tapped against the window, creating a soft rhythm that filled the uncomfortable silence between them. "Thanks for meeting me," Caroline said, her voice quiet but firm. She ordered a tea when the waitress came by, while Jack nursed his black coffee. Jack's fingers drummed against the ceramic mug. "You said it was about Clara." Caroline nodded, waiting until the waitress had moved away before speaking. "There's something you need to know." She took a deep breath. "Clara has a heart condition. She was born with it." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. He set his coffee down, his hand suddenly unsteady. "What kind of condition?" "It's called dilated cardiomyopathy. Her heart doesn't pump blood as well as it should." Caroline's voice wavered slightly. "She's had it all her life. There were so many hospital visits when she was little, so many close calls." Jack's throat felt tight. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "When would I have told you, Jack?" Caroline's eyes flashed. You were gone. You chose that life with the club over everything else. I tried to find you in the beginning, but you'd disappeared." The truth of her words stung. Jack remembered those early days, running from responsibility, diving deeper into the club life. He'd never looked back, never wondered if there might be consequences to his choices. "How bad is it?" he managed to ask. Caroline's fingers twisted the paper napkin in front of her. "She has good days and bad days. The medication helps, but—" She paused, collecting herself. "The doctors say she might need a transplant someday. She tries to hide how much it affects her, but I see it. The fatigue, the dizzy spells." Jack thought of Clara at the grocery store, trying to hide her weakness. His daughter had been fighting this battle her whole life, and he hadn't been there, not once. "Those fainting spells," he said roughly. "That's why?" Caroline nodded. "She pushes herself too hard sometimes. She doesn't want anyone to treat her differently." She looked directly at Jack. "She needs her father, Jack. Not just someone who shows up for awkward breakfasts, but really needs you. She's scared, even if she won't admit it." The weight of responsibility pressed down on Jack's shoulders. He thought of his life, the violence, the chaos, the running. What right did he have to step into Clara's life now? What could he possibly offer her? "I don't know how to be what she needs," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "None of us do at first," Caroline said softly. "But she's reaching out to you. She wants to know you, despite everything." She leaned forward. "It's time to step up, Jack. She needs more than just occasional visits and small talk." Jack stared into his coffee, seeing his reflection in the dark liquid. The man looking back at him was older, grayer, marked by years of hard living. The thought of Clara suffering alone all these years, while he'd been free of responsibility, made his chest ache with guilt. "What if I mess it up?" he asked, hating how vulnerable the question made him feel. "You already messed up by not being there," Caroline said, but there was no anger in her voice now, just tired truth. "The question is, what are you going to do about it now?" Clara lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun lazily above her. The pale afternoon light filtered through her curtains, casting soft shadows across her purple bedspread. Her heart felt heavy in her chest, not from her condition this time, but from the weight of everything unsaid. A gentle knock on her door made her turn her head. "Come in," she called softly. Jack stood in the doorway, looking out of place in his leather vest and worn jeans. He hesitated, then stepped inside, his boots quiet against the carpet. Without a word, he settled into the chair beside her bed, the old wood creaking under his weight. The silence stretched between them, filled with things neither knew how to say. Clara fidgeted with her blanket, pulling at a loose thread. Her medication bottles lined up on her nightstand like tiny soldiers, a constant reminder of her fragility. "Mom told you, didn't she?" Clara finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "About my heart?" Jack nodded, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "Yeah, she did." Clara turned to face him, studying the tattoos that covered his arms, the gray threading through his beard. He looked strong, capable, everything she'd imagined a father should be. Yet he seemed just as lost as she felt. "I used to make up stories about you," she admitted, her voice cracking slightly. "When I was little in the hospital, I'd tell the other kids my dad was away on important business, that he'd come back someday." She blinked back tears. "Some of them believed me, but I knew you weren't coming." Jack's jaw clenched, his knuckles white as he gripped his hands together. "The worst part wasn't the surgeries or the medications," Clara continued, the words spilling out now. "It was watching other kids with their dads. At school events, at the park. They all had someone to protect them. To make them feel safe. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. I just had empty space where you should have been. The ceiling fan whirred above them, marking the silence that followed. Every time I ended up in the hospital, I'd hope maybe this time you'd show up. Maybe someone would find you, tell you your daughter needed you. Clara's voice grew quieter. But you never came. And eventually, I stopped hoping. Jack remained still, his face a mask of controlled emotion, but his eyes betrayed the pain her words caused him. I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad, Clara said, twisting the blanket in her hands. I need you to understand. I'm scared all the time. Scared of my heart giving out, scared of being alone, scared of people leaving me. She looked at him directly. And now I'm scared that just when I've found you, you'll disappear again. Jack's mouth opened, then closed. The words he wanted to say stuck somewhere in his throat. His hand moved slightly, as if to reach for hers, but stopped halfway. The gesture hung between them, unfinished, like so much of their relationship. Clara waited, hoping he would say something, anything, to fill the void that had existed between them for so long. But Jack remained silent, his emotions warring behind his eyes, trapped behind years of carefully constructed walls. Jack sat in his truck outside Clara's house, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street. He'd changed his shirt 3 times before settling on a clean black button-down, probably the nicest thing he owned. His leather vest was conspicuously absent, replaced by a simple jean jacket. Taking a deep breath, he walked up to the front door and knocked. Caroline answered, surprise flickering across her face at his cleaned-up appearance. Is Clara ready? He asked, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Caroline called up the stairs, and moments later, Clara appeared, wearing a simple blue dress that made her look even more delicate than usual. She'd put effort into her appearance, too, her auburn hair carefully styled, a touch of makeup on her pale face. You look nice, Jack managed, the words feeling clumsy in his mouth. Thanks, Clara replied softly, grabbing her cardigan from the coat rack. You too. The drive to Mario's Italian restaurant was quiet, broken only by the low rumble of the truck's engine and the occasional direction from Jack. He'd chosen this place carefully, not too fancy to make them uncomfortable, but nice enough to show he was trying. The hostess led them to a booth in the corner, away from the busier sections of the restaurant. Jack noticed how Clara kept her movements measured, careful, a habit born from years of managing her condition. They have good pasta here, Jack said, trying to break the silence as they studied their menus. At least that's what I've heard. Clara nodded, her fingers fidgeting with the corner of her menu. I like Italian food. Their server came by, and Jack ordered a Coke while Clara chose water with lemon. More silence followed, heavy with unspoken words. So, Jack cleared his throat. How are you feeling today? Better, Clara said. The new medication seems to be helping. Jack nodded, wishing he knew more about her condition, about what to ask. That's good. They ordered their food, spaghetti and meatballs for Jack, fettuccine Alfredo for Clara. As they waited, Jack struggled to find topics of conversation that wouldn't lead to painful territory. Do you like movies? He asked finally. Clara's face brightened slightly. Yes, especially old classics. Mom and I watch them together sometimes. Yeah? Jack leaned forward, grateful for the spark of interest. Which ones? Roman Holiday is my favorite, Clara said, her voice growing more animated. And Casablanca. Have you seen them? Jack shook his head. More of a Western guy myself. John Wayne, Clint Eastwood. Maybe. Clara hesitated, then continued. Maybe we could watch one sometime. Together? The hope in her voice made Jack's chest tighten. Yeah, we could do that. Their food arrived, steam rising from the plates. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the awkwardness easing slightly. This is really good, Clara said, twirling pasta around her fork. Thank you for bringing me here. Jack watched as she took small, careful bites, noting how she seemed to tire even from the simple act of eating. Yet she kept going, determined to make the most of their time together. I'm glad you came, he said gruffly, meaning it more than he could express. As they finished their meal, Clara looked up at him with a genuine smile, small but real. Thanks for showing up, Jack. It means a lot. The simple words hit him hard, and all he could do was nod, his throat too tight for words. The autumn breeze rustled through the park as Jack and Clara walked along the tree-lined path. They'd been doing this more often lately, taking short walks, trying to build some kind of relationship. Clara insisted on these outings, even though Jack could see how each step seemed to cost her energy. The leaves are beautiful, Clara said, looking up at the red and gold canopy above them. Her face was pale, more so than usual, but her eyes sparkled as she took in the scenery. Jack walked beside her, matching his long strides to her shorter ones. He'd learned to slow down for her, to watch for the little signs that told him she needed rest. Right now, he noticed her breathing was becoming labored, though she tried to hide it. Maybe we should sit for a bit, he suggested, gesturing to a nearby bench. Clara shook her head. I'm fine. Just a little... Her words cut off as her eyes rolled back. Jack lunged forward, catching her before she hit the ground. Clara? His heart hammered in his chest as he cradled her limp form. Clara, can you hear me? Other park visitors rushed over, offering help. Jack barely heard them. All he could focus on was Clara's still face, her shallow breathing. With trembling hands, he pulled out his phone and called 911. The ambulance ride was a blur. Jack followed close behind on his motorcycle, breaking more than a few traffic laws to keep the ambulance in sight. At the hospital, they whisked Clara away, leaving Jack to pace the waiting room like a caged animal. Hours passed. Jack's boots wore a path in the linoleum floor. Finally, a doctor approached. Dr. Matthews, according to his name tag. His face was grave. Mr. Carter? The doctor gestured to a quiet corner. Please, have a seat. Jack remained standing, his fists clenched. How is she? Clara's condition has deteriorated significantly, Dr. Matthews said quietly. The medication isn't working as well as we'd hoped. Her heart... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Her heart is failing faster than we anticipated. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Jack gripped the back of a chair to steady himself. How long? Without a transplant? Months, maybe weeks. We're putting her on the priority list, but... Jack cut him off. Can I see her? The doctor nodded, leading him to Clara's room. She lay in the hospital bed, looking impossibly small among the machines and monitors. Her eyes fluttered open as Jack approached. Hey, she whispered. Jack pulled a chair close to her bedside. His large, calloused hand engulfed her small one. Words failed him as he looked at his daughter. His daughter, who he'd only just found, who he might lose before he really got to know her. I'm sorry, Clara said softly. I ruined our walk. Jack's throat tightened. Even now she was trying to make him feel better. He squeezed her hand gently. Don't, he managed. Don't apologize. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to meet her eyes. I'm not going anywhere, Clara. Whatever happens, whatever we need to do, I'm here. You understand? Tears welled in Clara's eyes as she nodded. Jack held her hand tighter, as if he could anchor her to this world through sheer force of will. The steady beep of the heart monitor filled the silence between them, each sound a reminder of how precious and precarious these moments were. The hospital's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Jack's face as he sat in the uncomfortable chair beside Clara's bed. The steady beeping of machines kept time with his troubled thoughts. Clara slept peacefully, her chest rising and falling in a gentle rhythm, while Jack's mind raced through 2 decades of memories he'd never have. Her first steps, her first words, first day of school, all those birthdays, Christmases, scraped knees, and childhood fears, moments when a father should have been there. Jack rubbed his weathered face with calloused hands, his leather jacket creaking as he shifted in the chair. "I should have been there," he whispered to the quiet room. The words felt hollow, inadequate against the weight of his absence. He thought about the man he'd been back then, angry, reckless, dangerous. The kind of man who'd walk away from Caroline without a backward glance, too caught up in his own problems to consider anyone else's needs. The kind of man who'd missed his own daughter's entire childhood because he was too busy running with a rough crowd. Looking at Clara now, so fragile in the hospital bed, Jack's chest tightened with regret. She had his jawline, his dark hair. How many times had Caroline looked at their daughter and seen his features staring back at her? How many times had Clara asked about her father, only to be met with silence? The night stretched endlessly. Jack watched the shadows creep across the floor as the moon made its journey across the sky. Around 3 a.m, he pulled out his phone and stared at it. Caroline's number was there. They'd exchanged contact information after Clara's diagnosis. His thumb hovered over the call button. Pride and shame warred within him, but Clara's condition had put everything into sharp perspective. With a deep breath, he pressed call and stepped into the hallway. The phone rang 3 times before Caroline answered, her voice thick with sleep. "Jack? Is Clara okay?" "Yeah, she's sleeping," he said quietly. I needed to talk to you." There was a pause on the other end. "Okay." Jack leaned against the wall, his free hand clenched in a fist. "I'm sorry, Caroline, for everything, for walking away, for not being there when you both needed me." The silence stretched between them, filled with 20 years of hurt and regret. "I know why you kept her from me," he continued. "I wasn't fit to be anyone's father back then, but I want you to know, I'm sorry for putting you in that position, for making you raise her alone." He heard Caroline take a shaky breath. "Thank you, Jack. I needed to hear that." "I was so angry when I found out," he admitted. "But now I just see all the time I wasted, all the years I can't get back." "We can't change the past," Caroline said softly. "But you're here now. That's what matters to Clara." Jack nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I want to do right by her now. Whatever time we have left, I want to make it count." "I know you do," Caroline replied, her voice gentle. "That's why I'm glad you're here now. She needs her father, Jack. She always has." The words hit him hard, but they also lifted something heavy from his shoulders. He couldn't change the years he'd missed, but he could be here now, in this moment, when Clara needed him most. The morning sun filtered through the hospital room's window, casting a warm glow across Clara's bed. Jack sat in his usual spot, his leather jacket draped over the back of the chair. Clara looked better today, some color returning to her cheeks as she picked at her breakfast. "I used to make up stories about you," Clara said suddenly, pushing her breakfast tray away. "When I was little, I mean. The other kids would talk about their dads, and I'd invent these amazing adventures about where mine was." Jack's throat tightened. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "What kind of adventures?" "Sometimes you were a secret agent, sometimes an explorer." Clara smiled faintly. But mostly I imagined you were just somewhere out there, thinking about me too. Jack rubbed his hands together, the tattoos on his knuckles catching the sunlight. I wish I had been. Mom never said anything bad about you, Clara continued. But the other kids, they weren't always nice. Being the girl without a dad, it made me different. I was already different enough with my heart condition. I was running with a bad crowd back then, Jack admitted, his voice rough. Your mom and I, we were young. I was angry at the world, thought I knew everything. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I wasn't the kind of man who should have been anyone's father. Clara twisted the hospital blanket between her fingers. Did you love her? Mom, I mean. Yeah, I did. Jack nodded slowly. But love isn't always enough when you're not ready to change. I hurt her, Clara. Not with my fists. I never did that. But with my choices. The company I kept, the risks I took. She was trying to protect me from that life, Clara said. She told me last night, after you left, about the motorcycle gang, the fights, everything. Jack's shoulders tensed. She was right to keep you away. The man I was then, he wouldn't have been good for you. But what about the man you are now? Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. Jack looked at his daughter, really looked at her. She had his dark hair, Caroline's gentle eyes. 24 years of life lived without him, and here she was, still willing to give him a chance. I'm trying to figure that out, he admitted. All these years I've been living like I was alone in the world. No responsibilities except to myself. Now, he gestured helplessly. Now I find out I have this amazing daughter, and she's sick, and I've missed so much time. I used to be so angry, Clara said. Every Father's Day, every daddy-daughter dance, every time I ended up in the hospital. I'd wonder why you weren't there, why you didn't want me. Jack's heart clenched. Clara, if I'd known— I know, she interrupted. I know that now. But what I need you to understand is— She took a deep breath, meeting his eyes steadily. I don't need you to be perfect. I just need you to be here. Jack reached out and took her hand, his larger one engulfing her smaller one. I promise you, Clara, I'm not going anywhere. Whatever happens, whatever we face, I'm here. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees at Miller Park, scattering golden leaves across the walking path. Jack walked beside Clara, matching his normally long strides to her slower pace. He kept one hand hovering near her elbow, ready to steady her if needed, though she seemed stronger today. Mom used to bring me here when I was little, Clara said, pausing to watch a squirrel scamper across their path. She'd push me on those swings over there. She pointed to a small playground where children were playing. Jack nodded, trying to picture a younger Clara, carefree and laughing. Must have been nice. It was. Clara wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself. Though I couldn't always play as long as the other kids. My heart, you know. Jack's jaw tightened. Yeah, I know now. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, passing elderly couples and young mothers with strollers. Jack noticed how Clara would smile and wave at some of them. She seemed to know everyone. Small town, she explained, catching his questioning look. When you spend as much time at the local hospital as I do, you get to know people. Must be hard, Jack said, helping her step over a large crack in the sidewalk. Growing up with all that? Clara shrugged. You get used to it. The medications, the doctor visits, the limitations. She stopped at a wooden bench overlooking a small pond. Can we sit for a minute? Course. Jack helped her settle on the bench, then sat beside her, leaving enough space between them to be comfortable. A family of ducks paddled across the pond, the babies following their mother in a neat line. Clara watched them with a soft smile. Sometimes I wonder what it would have been like if things had been different, if you'd known about me from the start. Jack ran a hand through his graying hair. I wonder that too. But I was a different man back then. Angry, reckless. And now? Now? Jack considered the question. Now I'm trying to be better. For you. Clara turned to look at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. You don't have to change who you are. Just be here. That's all I've ever wanted. They watched as an elderly man threw breadcrumbs to the ducks, creating a frenzy of splashing and quacking. A child's laughter rang out from the playground. You know what's funny? Clara said, breaking their comfortable silence. I used to be scared of bikers. The leather, the tattoos, it all seemed so intimidating. Now here I am, sitting in the park with one. Jack chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound. Guess I'm not so scary anymore, huh? No, Clara smiled. You're not. She hesitated, then added, Thank you, Jack, for being patient with me, for not pushing too hard. I know this isn't easy for you either. Jack felt something warm spread through his chest. It was the first time Clara had really acknowledged his efforts, and it meant more than he expected. I think, Clara continued, her voice soft but steady, I think I'm starting to trust you. Really trust you, I mean. Jack nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He smiled instead, proud of how far they'd come, even as uncertainty about his role as a father still nagged at him. But for now, sitting here with his daughter on a peaceful autumn afternoon, maybe that was enough. The coffee shop buzzed with afternoon activity as Clara and Jack sat at a small corner table. Clara stirred her tea absently, while Jack nursed his black coffee. The past week had been good. They'd fallen into an easy rhythm of short visits and careful conversations. So then Mom tried to bake this cake, Clara was saying, her eyes bright with amusement. But she forgot about it and... She stopped mid-sentence, her hand flying to her chest. Jack recognized the signs immediately. The slight sway, the sudden paleness of her face. Clara? I'm fine, she whispered, but her fingers gripped the edge of the table. Just need a minute. Before Jack could respond, Clara's eyes rolled back, and she started to slump forward. He lunged across the table, catching her before she could hit her head. Coffee cups clattered to the floor. Someone call an ambulance! Jack's voice boomed through the coffee shop as he eased Clara onto the floor, cradling her head. The other customers jumped into action. A barista rushed over with a cold cloth while another dialed 911. Jack held Clara's hand, counting the seconds until her eyes fluttered open. Dad? She mumbled, then seemed to realize where she was. Her cheeks flushed red as she noticed the crowd gathering around them. Oh, no. Take it easy, Jack said, helping her sit up slowly. The ambulance is coming. No. Clara pushed away from him, trying to stand. No ambulance, I'm fine. This happens all the time. Clara, you need... I said I'm fine. Her voice cracked with embarrassment. She managed to get to her feet, swaying slightly. I don't need everyone making a fuss, and I don't need you hovering over me like I'm some fragile thing that's going to break. Jack stood too, his hands outstretched uncertainly. Nobody thinks you're fragile. We're just worried. Well, don't be. Clara grabbed her purse with trembling hands. I've dealt with this my whole life. I don't need you feeling guilty or pitying me now. I won't be your burden. You're not a burden, Jack said, his voice rough with emotion. You're my daughter. Am I? Clara's eyes filled with tears. Because a few weeks ago, you didn't even know I existed, and now you feel obligated to care because I'm sick. Well, I don't want your obligation. Jack stepped forward, frustration evident in his clenched jaw. That's not what this is. I'm here because I want to be. I'm not going anywhere. That's what everyone says, Clara whispered, backing away. Until it gets too hard, until they see how much work it is to care about someone who might not. She stopped, wiping angrily at her tears. "I can't do this right now." "Clara, wait!" But she was already pushing through the crowd, ignoring the concerned murmurs and Jack's calls. She stumbled slightly at the door but kept going. Jack moved to follow her, but she turned back one last time. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible. "Just leave me alone." Then she was gone, leaving Jack standing in the middle of the coffee shop, surrounded by spilled coffee and worried strangers. He watched through the window as she got into her car, his heart heavy with the knowledge that she was running not from him, but from the possibility of being hurt again. The same way he'd run all those years ago. Jack sat in his garage, surrounded by the familiar smell of motor oil and leather. His old motorcycle jacket hung on a hook nearby, its patches and worn edges telling stories of a different life. The setting sun cast long shadows through the open door, painting everything in shades of orange and gold. He pulled out the small photo Caroline had given him. Clara as a baby, all pink cheeks and bright eyes. His thumb traced the edge of the picture, worn smooth from the many times he'd handled it over the past weeks. Something tight squeezed in his chest as he studied her tiny face. "I missed so much," he muttered to himself, running a hand over his graying beard. The events at the coffee shop kept replaying in his mind. The way Clara had collapsed, how fragile she'd looked in his arms, and then her fierce determination to push him away. It reminded him of himself, always keeping people at arm's length, afraid of letting anyone get too close. But something had changed. The thought of Clara suffering alone made his chest ache in a way he'd never experienced before. This wasn't just about making up for lost time or easing his guilt anymore. Somewhere between that first meeting outside the diner and now, Clara had become more than just his biological daughter. She'd become his little girl. Jack stood up and paced the garage, his heavy boots scuffing against the concrete floor. Every protective instinct in him wanted to wrap Clara in cotton wool and shield her from the world. But that wasn't what she needed. She needed someone to stand beside her, to be strong enough to face whatever came next. Together. He stopped at his workbench and picked up his phone, staring at it for a long moment before making a decision. His fingers, rough from years of mechanical work, carefully dialed Caroline's number. "We need to do something," he said when she answered. "For Clara." Caroline's voice was cautious but hopeful. "What did you have in mind?" "A gathering. Small, nothing fancy, but everyone who cares about her, all in one place." Jack's voice grew stronger as he spoke. "Show her she's not alone, that we're not going anywhere, no matter what happens." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That's actually a good idea, Jack." He spent the next hour making calls, to the diner staff who'd helped that first night, to Clara's favorite aunt, who Caroline suggested, to a few others who'd become part of their expanding circle. Each person agreed readily, their voices warm with concern for Clara. Jack found himself writing notes on an old receipt, food to order, things to prepare. He couldn't remember the last time he'd planned anything more complicated than a bike maintenance schedule, but this felt important. This felt right. Looking around his garage, at the tools and parts that had been his whole world for so long, Jack realized how empty it all seemed now. He'd spent years building walls around himself, keeping everyone out. But Clara had somehow slipped through those defenses, bringing with her a chance at something he'd never thought possible. A real family. He picked up his phone again, this time to text Clara. "I know you're angry, but I'm still here. I'll always be here." The message sent, and Jack began clearing space in his garage, already planning how to transform it for the gathering. It wasn't much, but it was a start. A way to show Clara that some people stayed, that some things were worth fighting for, and that she wasn't just his obligation. She was his daughter, and he was finally ready to be her father. Clara stood at Jack's garage door, her hand hovering over the handle. The text message from him had been unexpected, an invitation to dinner at his place. Even more surprising was that her mother would be there too. Her heart fluttered, partly from nerves and partly from her condition, as she gathered the courage to enter. The garage door creaked open, and Clara's eyes widened. The usually cluttered space had been transformed. Tools and parts had been cleared away, replaced by a modest dining table covered with a clean tablecloth. Strings of warm lights hung from the ceiling, casting a gentle glow over everything. The familiar smell of motor oil mingled with the aroma of takeout from her favorite restaurant. Jack stood awkwardly by the table, his massive frame looking somehow smaller in this domestic setting. He'd traded his usual leather jacket for a clean button-down shirt, though he'd kept his worn jeans and boots. "Hey, kid," he said, his gruff voice softer than usual. Carolyn emerged from behind him, looking as surprised as Clara felt by the setup. She wore a simple dress and a hesitant smile. "This is unexpected," she said, glancing around the transformed space. "I ain't much for decorating," Jack mumbled, running a hand through his gray, streaked hair. "But I wanted to do something, proper." Clara's eyes stung with unexpected tears. The effort he'd put in was obvious in every detail, from the carefully arranged plates to the vase of wildflowers centerpiece that looked hilariously out of place in the garage. "Come sit," Jack said, pulling out a chair for her. His movements were careful, deliberate, like he was handling something precious. As they settled around the table, the initial awkwardness hung heavy in the air. Jack cleared his throat several times before speaking. "Look, I know I ain't been the best at, any of this." He gestured vaguely between them. "But I want you both to know that I'm trying." Clara's hands twisted in her lap. "You didn't have to do all this." "Yeah, I did." Jack's voice was firm. "Because you're my daughter, Clara, and Caroline." He looked at her mother. "You did right by her all these years. I want us to try being a proper family, whatever that looks like." Caroline reached across the table and squeezed Clara's hand. "We'd like that too, wouldn't we, honey?" Clara nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Jack stood up, lifting his glass of soda. He'd forgone his usual beer for the occasion. "I ain't good with words, but—" He paused, collecting his thoughts. "To new beginnings, to family, to doing better?" Clara raised her glass, her hand trembling slightly. "Thank you," she whispered, meeting Jack's eyes. "For trying. For wanting to be here." The simple words seemed to hit Jack hard. His eyes grew misty, though he tried to hide it by taking a quick sip from his glass. Caroline raised her glass too, completing their small circle. In that moment, surrounded by the odd mix of garage equipment and dinner party decorations, Clara felt something shift. It wasn't perfect. Her father was still a gruff ex-biker, her mother still worried too much, and her own health remained uncertain. But for the first time, it felt like they were truly a family, however unconventional. Their glasses clinked together, the sound echoing in the garage like a promise. After Clara excused herself to rest, Jack and Caroline remained at the decorated table in the garage. The string lights cast soft shadows across their faces, highlighting the years etched in the corners of their eyes. Jack fidgeted with his empty glass, his calloused fingers tracing the rim. "Caroline," he started, his voice rougher than usual. "I need to say something." She looked up at him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The years had been kind to her. She still had that same quiet strength he remembered, though now tempered by time and motherhood. "I was wrong," Jack continued, forcing the words past the tightness in his throat. Back then, the way I lived, I was dangerous, violent, not fit to be around anyone decent. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But I should have tried harder. Should have been better for both of you. Caroline's shoulders tensed, then relaxed. We were so young, Jack. I was terrified, not just of your lifestyle, but of what it might do to Clara. She shook her head, memories flickering across her face. Every time you came home bloody from a fight, every time the police showed up at our door, I couldn't expose a child to that. You did right, Jack admitted, his massive frame seeming to shrink under the weight of his confession. Keeping her away from me, it was the right call. But now... He gestured helplessly at the space around them. Now she's sick, Caroline's voice cracked. And I'm scared, Jack. I'm so scared. Her composure crumbled, tears welling in her eyes. The doctors say her heart is getting weaker. What if... She couldn't finish the sentence. Jack reached across the table, hesitating before placing his weathered hand over hers. Hey, he said softly, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. Clara's tough, like her mother. Caroline gave a watery laugh. She's stubborn like her father, too. I want to be here for her, Jack said firmly. For both of you. I know it's late, too late, maybe, but I'm not running anymore. Whatever happens with Clara's health, whatever she needs, I'm here. Caroline studied his face, searching for something. You've changed, she said finally. The old Jack wouldn't have arranged this dinner, wouldn't have tried so hard. The old Jack was a fool, he replied simply. Caroline wiped her eyes with her free hand. Thank you, she whispered, for stepping up now, for trying with Clara. She needs her father, especially now. Their eyes met across the table, decades of hurt and regret passing between them. But there was something else too, understanding, forgiveness, and a shared love for their daughter that transcended their past mistakes. Caroline squeezed his hand once before letting go. It wasn't a romantic gesture, those days were long past, but it carried the weight of reconciliation, of putting old wounds to rest for the sake of something more important. We should check on Clara, Caroline said, standing up. Her voice was steady again, but softer than before. Jack nodded, rising from his chair. They'd said what needed to be said. The past couldn't be changed, but the future, Clara's future, that was something they could face together. The autumn breeze rustled through the leaves as Jack and Clara sat on the porch swing of her mother's house. Clara wore a thick cardigan, and Jack had draped his leather jacket over her shoulders when he noticed her shivering. The gesture, simple as it was, made her smile. Tell me another story about your motorcycle adventures, Clara said, pulling the jacket tighter around herself. The leather still held his warmth, and it smelled of motor oil and cigarettes, a scent she'd grown oddly fond of. Jack chuckled, the sound rumbling deep in his chest. Well, there was this one time in Arizona. He launched into a tale about a broken-down bike and a kind stranger who helped him fix it. Clara noticed how he carefully edited out the rougher parts of his past, choosing instead to focus on the moments of connection and kindness he'd experienced on the road. Their weekly dinners had become a routine. Sometimes they ate at the diner where they first met, other times at Caroline's house. Jack even invited them to his place occasionally, though he always apologized for the motorcycle parts scattered around his garage. One afternoon, while they were working on a puzzle together, something Clara enjoyed during her rest periods, she had another episode. Her heart started racing, and the room spun. But this time, instead of hiding it, she reached for Jack's hand. Dad, she whispered, the word still new on her tongue. I need to sit down. Without hesitation, Jack helped her to the couch. He knew exactly what to do now. Get her water, make sure she was comfortable, and most importantly, stay with her until it passed. No panic, no awkward hovering, just quiet support. "You're getting better at this," Clara said later, color returning to her cheeks. "Had a good teacher," Jack replied, patting her hand. "You're pretty patient with this old bear." During her doctor's appointments, Jack would sit in the waiting room, thumbing through outdated magazines he had no interest in, just so she'd see a familiar face when she came out. Sometimes he'd bring her favorite sandwich from the deli across the street, remembering how hospital food made her queasy. Carolyn watched their relationship grow with quiet satisfaction. She'd catch moments between them, Jack teaching Clara how to play chess, Clara showing him how to use his new smartphone, both of them laughing at his fumbling attempts to text. One evening, after a particularly good day, when Clara's tests had shown some improvement, they sat in Jack's garage. He'd cleared out a corner and set up a small seating area with comfortable chairs. The space that once held only tools and parts now had touches of home. A blanket Clara had brought, some family photos on the wall. "You know," Clara said, curled up in what had become her chair, "I used to dream about having a real family. Mom was amazing, but I always felt like something was missing." She traced the pattern on her teacup with her finger. "I'd see other kids with their dads at school events, and it hurt. I used to make up stories about where my dad was, what he was doing." Jack listened, his heart heavy but full. "But now," she continued, looking up at him with eyes that matched his own, "for the first time in my life, I don't have to pretend anymore. This, you, Mom, all of us together, it feels real. It feels like family." Jack shifted in his chair, the old leather creaking beneath him. The garage had grown darker as evening settled in, and the single overhead light cast long shadows across the concrete floor. He watched Clara, noting how the light caught the auburn in her hair, so much like her mother's. The weight of everything they'd been through these past months pressed on his chest. Every doctor's visit, every fainting spell, every moment of fear and uncertainty had changed him. He wasn't the same man who'd stood outside that diner smoking a cigarette, trying to keep the world at arm's length. "Clara," he said, his voice rougher than usual. He cleared his throat and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I need you to know something." She looked up from her tea, her eyes questioning. The blanket she'd brought weeks ago was wrapped around her shoulders, making her look smaller, more vulnerable. "I've done a lot of running in my life," he continued, choosing his words carefully. "Ran from responsibility, ran from your mother, ran from everything that scared me." He paused, rubbing his weathered hands together. "But I'm done running." Clara set her tea down on the small table beside her chair, giving him her full attention. The distant sound of crickets filtered through the garage's open door, filling the silence between them. "I know you're scared," he said. "Hell, I'm scared too. Every time you have an episode, every time we go to the doctor's." He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "But I want you to know something, and I need you to believe it." He reached across the space between them and took her hand in his. Her fingers were cold, and he wrapped both his hands around hers, trying to warm them. "I'm not going anywhere, Clara. Not ever again. Whatever happens with your health, whatever storms we have to weather, I'm here. Your old man's planted his feet, and nothing's gonna move me." Clara's eyes welled with tears, but she didn't look away. "You promise?" she whispered, sounding younger than her years. "I promise." His voice was firm, unwavering. "And bears don't break their promises." A small laugh escaped through Clara's tears. She squeezed his hand, and Jack felt something shift in his chest, like a final piece clicking into place. "How about we head inside?" he suggested, noticing her trying to suppress a shiver. "Your mom mentioned something about movie night." Clara nodded, wiping her eyes with the corner of the blanket. Can we watch that old Western you were talking about? The one with John Wayne? You bet. Jack stood, offering her his arm with exaggerated formality that made her giggle. They made their way into the house, where Caroline had already set up the living room with bowls of popcorn and soft drinks. The TV was on, its blue light flickering against the walls. Clara settled onto the couch between her parents, tucking her feet under her and leaning slightly against Jack's shoulder. Carolyn dimmed the lights and started the movie. As the opening credits rolled across the screen, Jack glanced down at Clara, who was already completely absorbed in the film. Her face was relaxed, peaceful. He caught Carolyn's eye over Clara's head, and they shared a quiet smile, the kind that spoke of healing, of family, of home. The movie played on, its familiar scenes washing over them in the darkened room. Clara's weight against his shoulder felt right, felt like belonging. For the first time in his life, Jack Bear Carter knew exactly where he was supposed to be. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of Clara's hospital room as Jack sat in the chair beside her bed, his large frame looking out of place among the sterile white surroundings. He'd been there all night, refusing to leave after Clara's latest checkup had shown some concerning results. "Dad?" Clara said softly, still getting used to calling him that. "You don't have to stay. I'm feeling much better now." Jack shook his head, his weathered face set with determination. "Not going anywhere, kiddo." He reached over and adjusted her blanket, his tattooed hands moving with surprising gentleness. "Besides, these chairs aren't half bad once you get used to them." Clara smiled, knowing he was lying. The chairs were horrible, but he'd stayed anyway, just like he'd promised. Over the next few weeks, Jack threw himself into learning everything he could about Clara's condition. He attended every doctor's appointment, took detailed notes, and asked questions that surprised even the specialists with their thoroughness. The nurses started calling him Papa Bear, a nickname that made Clara giggle and Jack pretend to grumble about. One afternoon, while they were walking through the hospital garden, part of Clara's prescribed exercise routine, Jack noticed her breathing was slightly labored. "Here," he said, guiding her to a nearby bench. "Take it easy." He pulled out the small oxygen monitor he now carried everywhere, clipping it to her finger with practiced ease. "You're getting good at this," Clara observed, watching as he checked her numbers. "Well," Jack shrugged, "figured if I could learn how to rebuild a Harley engine, I could learn this too." Their daily walks became a routine, each one a little longer than the last. Jack would tell stories about his younger days, carefully edited for content, making Clara laugh with tales of motorcycle rallies and cross-country rides. In return, Clara shared her dreams of becoming a writer, something she'd never told anyone else. The breakthrough came during a regular checkup. Dr. Thompson reviewed Clara's latest test results with raised eyebrows. "Your numbers are improving," she said, looking pleased. "Whatever you're doing, keep it up." Jack and Clara exchanged proud smiles. They both knew it wasn't just the medication. It was their shared determination, their refusal to give up, and the strength they drew from each other. To celebrate the good news, Jack suggested they go fishing at Lake Morrison, just like he used to do with his own father. Clara had never been fishing before, but she eagerly agreed. They arrived at the lake early one morning, the water still and mirror-like in the dawn light. Jack helped Clara set up her fishing rod, showing her how to bait the hook and cast the line. "The trick is patience," he explained, settling into his chair beside her. "Just like everything else we've been dealing with." Clara nodded, understanding he meant more than just fishing. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their lines bob gently in the water. A family of ducks swam past, the mother leading her ducklings in a perfect line. "You know," Clara said, her voice thoughtful. "I used to be so scared of the future. It felt like this big, dark thing hanging over me." She glanced at Jack, her eyes bright. "But now, I'm actually excited to see what comes next." Jack reached over and squeezed her hand, his heart full. The morning sun warmed their faces as they sat together by the peaceful lake, their fishing lines forgotten in the moment. Clara's color was better than it had been in months, and her smile, so like her mother's, was genuine and unworried. The late afternoon sun painted golden streaks across the lake's surface as Jack and Clara packed up their fishing gear. They hadn't caught much, just 2 small bass that they'd released back into the water, but that hadn't been the point of their outing. "I can't believe how much better I feel," Clara said, carefully folding up her camping chair. Her movements were stronger now, more assured than they'd been months ago. "The doctor said my heart's getting stronger." Jack nodded, his rough features softening as he watched her. "You're tough, kiddo. Tougher than I ever was." He secured their gear in the back of his truck, making sure everything was properly tied down. They settled on a weathered bench overlooking the lake, neither ready to head home just yet. Clara pulled out a small photo album from her bag, one she'd started keeping since they'd begun their journey together. "Remember this?" She pointed to a picture of Jack attempting to bake cookies in her kitchen. The counter was covered in flour, and his frustrated expression made them both laugh. "That was a disaster," Jack chuckled, his deep voice warm with affection. "Burned every single batch." "But you kept trying," Clara reminded him, turning the page. "Just like you did with everything else." The photos told their story. Awkward first meetings, hospital visits that gradually became less frequent, family dinners where the tension slowly melted away. There was even a shot of Jack and Caroline sharing a civil conversation, something that would have seemed impossible months ago. "I was so scared that first day," Clara admitted, her fingers tracing the edge of a photograph. "When I saw you outside the diner, I almost didn't say anything. But then I fainted, and you were there." Jack's weathered hand covered hers. "I was terrified too," he confessed. "Didn't know the first thing about being a father. Still don't, sometimes." "You figured it out pretty well," Clara said softly. She leaned against his shoulder, something that had become natural over time. "You know what Mom told me the other day? She said she's never seen me this happy." Jack felt something catch in his throat. He remembered the countless nights he'd spent, wondering if he was doing the right thing, if he was worthy of being in Clara's life. The guilt of his absence had weighed heavily on him, but watching Clara grow stronger, seeing her smile more freely, it had changed something fundamental inside him. "You gave me a second chance," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Both of you did." Clara smiled up at him. "And you gave me the father I always wanted." The setting sun cast long shadows across the lake, and a cool breeze rustled through the trees. Jack looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw how far they'd come. The fragile young woman who'd collapsed outside the diner had blossomed into someone strong and confident, though she still carried that same gentle spirit that had first touched his heart. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink lower on the horizon. Jack felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. This quiet moment with his daughter, the trust they'd built, the love they shared, it was more than redemption. It was healing for both of them. Clara pulled out her phone, holding it up. "One more for the album?" Jack nodded, wrapping his arm around her shoulders as she snapped the picture. In it, they were both smiling. Not the hesitant, uncertain smiles of their early days, but genuine expressions of joy and belonging. The aroma of pot roast and fresh-baked rolls filled Jack's modest home. The dining room table, a recent purchase he'd made specifically for family dinners, was set with mismatched plates and worn silverware. But nobody seemed to mind. Carolyn was arranging a bowl of salad, while Clara helped Jack carry the main course to the table. "This looks amazing," Clara said, settling into her chair. Her cheeks were flushed with health, a stark contrast to the pale, fragile young woman who'd collapsed outside the diner months ago. Jack watched as Caroline took her seat across from him. The tension that had once filled the space between them had mellowed into something softer, more forgiving. She caught his eye and gave him a small smile. "I can't believe you actually cooked all this," Caroline said, reaching for the salad bowl. The Jack I knew could barely make coffee. "YouTube tutorials," Jack admitted with a gruff laugh. "Figured it was time I learned how to do more than just order takeout." Clara beamed at both her parents. "Well, I think it's perfect. Everything's perfect." The simple statement carried weight. Jack remembered all the family dinners he'd missed, all the moments he could have had, but didn't. Now, watching Clara pass the rolls to her mother, seeing them both relaxed and happy in his home, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. "Remember when we tried to have that first dinner at the restaurant?" Clara asked, cutting into her pot roast. "We barely said 2 words to each other." "You were so nervous you knocked over your water glass," Jack recalled, his voice gentle. "And I had no idea what to say to make it better." Caroline shook her head, but she was smiling. "Look at you two now. Who would have thought?" They ate in comfortable silence for a few moments, the clink of silverware mixing with the soft music playing from Jack's old radio. Through the window, the setting sun cast warm light across their faces, making everything feel golden and peaceful. "I was thinking," Jack said, clearing his throat, "maybe we could make this a regular thing. Sunday dinners, I mean." Clara's face lit up. "Really? Every week?" "If your mother's okay with it," Jack added, glancing at Caroline. "I think that would be wonderful," Caroline replied, and the sincerity in her voice made Jack's chest tighten with emotion. Jack stood up, reaching for his glass of water. "Then I'd like to propose a toast." He waited as Clara and Caroline raised their glasses. "To new beginnings," he said, his voice rough with feeling, "and second chances." "To family," Clara added softly. "To healing," Caroline finished, their glasses clinked together, the sound ringing clear and true in the warm evening air. Jack looked at his daughter's smiling face, at Caroline's peaceful expression, and felt something settle in his soul. This was what he'd been missing all those years. Not just a family, but a sense of belonging, of purpose. The conversation flowed easily after that, filled with gentle laughter and shared memories. As Jack watched Clara tell an animated story about her day at work, her hands gesturing expressively, he couldn't help but marvel at how close he'd come to missing all of this, how one moment outside a diner had changed everything. Caroline caught his eye again, and this time her smile held understanding. They'd both made mistakes, both carried regrets, but they'd found their way here, to this moment, to this table where past hurts could finally heal. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.